Okay, welcome everyone this morning. We're continuing through the book of Acts. We're in Acts 23. We're going to pick up in 19. And if you remember what's going on, is this actually Paul's nephew. He had heard that they were going to try and attack Paul and kill him. So he has went and told the commander about it. So we see the commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him." The other thing I find interesting, shows you why Jesus called the Jews whitewashed tombs, because they're so good at pointing out sin in others. But what is it whenever you're doing one thing, but you're actually going to do opposite of what you said? It's lying. That's what I'm getting at. So here we see the Sanhedrin lying, which is a violation of the Ten Commandments. But they're setting this plot, and they're lying and telling the Romans that we just want to ask some questions of him. Well, they have no intention of asking questions before the Sanhedrin. They want to kill him before he gets there. And this is what he says. He said, "Do not give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." So we see here they're lying, trying to set up a trap for Paul. They really have no intention of questioning him before the Sanhedrin. They just want to get him an opportunity to kill him. It says, "The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Obviously, he's concerned about the young man. He knows he's putting his own life at risk. Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment," this is where we left off on Wednesday, "of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. So it shows clearly that he took an entire army with him, in essence, to protect him. So again, it shows the desire of the Romans to actually protect Paul. It says, provide horses for Paul so that he might be taken safely to the governor Felix." So then he wrote a letter, and this is what his letter is. So we actually have the letter, a copy of the letter in Scripture that he wrote. It says, "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings." So this is Claudius writing to the governor. He says, "This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him. But I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen." Did it actually go out quite that way? Yeah, it sounded like he's kind of stretching the truth a little. Because remember, he kind of left out the part that he was going to beat him, and he was going to beat the truth out of him. But no, he sounds like he swooped in and rescued a Roman citizen. I love politicians. They never change. He says, "I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin." Notice again, he fails to mention that he ordered first to beat the answers out of Paul, but no, he swooped in and rescued him, and he was going to hold a fair trial to figure out what's going on. Then he says, "I found that the accusations had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment." So my question is, why is Paul a prisoner now? Well, because it's all part of God's plan. And actually, I think more than anything, he is actually, and you'll see, he's going to take him, he's treated quite nice where he's at. He's actually, I would say, almost what you would call protective custody. Yeah. So he's not really in prison, but he is being held a prisoner. And again, getting back to the statement here, what he's saying in his letter is, it's an issue with the Jews. As far as us, the Romans, he's not done anything wrong, is what he's saying. I don't know what's going on. And then he says, "When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So now the commander, what's the commander just done?
Passed him on.
He's passed him on. You've heard this before. That's above my pay grade. Yeah. So what he's done is he's passed it on to who he reports to. It's like, it's just beyond what I can do, so I'm sending it to you. It says, "So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris." So to give you an idea of where they're at, down there at the bottom of Jerusalem, there's Antipatris, and they're eventually going to make it all the way up to Caesarea. So it's about 30 miles. So what they did, they escorted him by military in the middle of the night, and once they got him safe, they let part of them go with him, but as far as that huge army they had, they returned. It says the next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So they let a smaller group follow him on to protect him. So, and then the rest of the military, that whole army he had gathered together, they went back to the barracks. So then he's going to reach Caesarea. So when the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. So that was the letter we had just read. So again, this is where the army left them, and then a small group of soldiers, the cavalry, went with him on up to Caesarea. So Paul is up in Caesarea right now, which is about another 30 miles. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, first of all, why do you think the governor asked what province Paul was from? Right, verify, and each governor had power over certain provinces. He wanted to make sure he was one of his constituents. He was one that he represented. So, and it was. So he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So again, it shows you he wasn't held in a prison, or he was actually treated quite nicely, and he was actually kept in the palace during this time. And that's important to note too, because again, we see that God is actually taking care of Paul through the Romans at this point in time, instead of punishing him in prison or something like that. And again, what does that reveal about how the governor felt about Paul? The fact that he's basically got him in his palace. Yeah, he respected him. I think Paul is he's one of those. I think Paul is almost like, I guess you could almost compare him like a Donald Trump. You either love him or hate him, it seems like. And people loved Paul and people hated Paul, but typically it was the Jews that hated Paul. But Paul is well known. I think when you got to know Paul, people generally liked him. So it says, because I think the reason why he was who he was. He wasn't false. Paul they'd tell the truth. There was nothing false about him. So 5 days later, the high priest, Ananias, went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. So what they've done is they basically moved that then to Caesarea, and they're holding court now before the governor. And you've got the Jewish leaders, along with a lawyer, Tertullus, bringing charges against Paul. So it's now you're hearing a court. These court's in session. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. So in a courtroom today, we know that Tertullus was a lawyer, but what type of lawyer would he be? Right, he's a prosecuting attorney. So he's coming in and he is prosecuting his case, prosecuting Paul and presenting his case against Paul. And listen to his opening statement. Keep in mind, the Romans and the Jews don't get along. A matter of fact, in 70 A.D., you'll see the Romans come in and destroy the temple and just burn it to the ground. So the Jews and the Romans do not get along. They can't stand each other. But listen to this opening statement. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to worry you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. You've ever heard that gag me with a fork or whatever you want to call it? That is. I mean, he is buttering him up. Because keep in mind, the relationship between the Jews and the Roman government is not very good. And actually, as I'd mentioned, Felix, who happens to be the governor of Judea, he was there from 52 to 60 A.D., and then just 10 years after him, in 70 A.D., is when the Roman government came in and destroyed the temple. So they don't like each other, but he is really buttering himself up. The Roman army, this is a description of when they came in and destroyed the temple, routed the Jews and followed in hot pursuit right up to the temple itself. Then one of the soldiers, without awaiting any orders and with no dread of so momentous a deed, but urged on, this is recorded by one of the historians, but urged on by some supernatural force, snatched a blazing piece of wood and climbed on another soldier's back, hurled a flaming brand through a low golden window. That gave them access on the north side, the rooms that surrounded the sanctuary. As the flame shot up, the Jews let out a shout of dismay that matched their tragedy. They flocked to rescue with no thought of sparing their lives, their husbandry, their strength, for the sacred structure that they had constantly guarded with such devotion was vanishing before their very eyes. So that gives you a little bit of eyewitness account of when the Jews came in and destroyed the temple. So again, the relationship between the Jews and the Romans was not good. But he says he's worried about him. So I don't want to worry you, and please allow me to hear what I've got to say. So here's his accusation. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots. Does that sound familiar? Among all the Jews all over the world. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. Here's another Ten Commandment. Thou shalt not give false testimony against your neighbor. It's funny how the Jews forgot about that one too, didn't they? They're breaking God's commandments left and right. Again, that shows you why Jesus calls them whitewashed tombs. Have you ever been falsely accused of something? How does that make you feel? Yeah, it's really frustrating, especially when you know you did the right thing. And I can't help but think of this verse in Matthew 5:11 says, Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. So Paul was actually blessed during this time, and I believe we're in the same way. Now, Acts 24:7 is where we're at next. Does your Bible have Acts 24:7? Your translation?
Yeah.
Some don't.
Yeah.
No.
Some translations left that out because in older versions it's not there, but in newer versions of the Greek text it is there. So, and here's what it says. It says, But Lysis, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands. So what is this guy talking about, this prosecutor, where he's saying that there was a bunch of violence that took Paul out of his hands? Well, I think he's referring back to originally, if you remember the original scene in Acts 23:10, it says, when the dispute became so violent, the commander was afraid Paul be torn to pieces by them. So he ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So then the prosecuting attorney continues. He says, By examining yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we're bringing against him. The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. So when the governor motioned for him to speak, so now the prosecutor has given his opening statement. Now the governor is looking to Paul and say, okay, it's your turn. Paul says, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Notice Paul didn't butter him up. Oh, great, and you're doing this. He said, I just know you've got experience with this, so I'm going to give you my defense. He says, you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. Just totally opposite of what he's been accused of. But what is Paul sticking to there? Yeah, he's sticking to the facts. This is what happened. I was going up to Jerusalem, you can see, and I did not do any of this stuff they're asking. And he says, and they cannot prove to you the charges they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. So again, you see, Paul, he's not afraid to say I'm a Christian. He says, I am a follower of Christ in this new sect that they call the way, and I worship the God of our ancestors, which I'm sure got them going. He says, I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. And I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonial clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Or these who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin. Unless it was this one thing I shouted as I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. Again, Paul's bringing up the resurrection of the dead, because remember, there's two groups, Pharisees and Sadducees, so he's kind of pitting them against each other like he did before. But Paul's just stating fact. This is exactly what happened. What they're saying is not true. This is what happened. Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, that's interesting the way that's put. Obviously, someone in Felix's family also may very well have been a Christian because he was acquainted with them. Felix knew it. So Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, and remember, the way is the church, the Christian church. You basically say he was well acquainted with the early church. Adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. So again, we see Paul is basically under house arrest in the temple, and he's allowed to move about freely, and his friends come visit him, and they're waiting on this Felix. Felix is when the commander, Lysias, they're waiting on this Lysias to come, this commander for him to make the decisions. So several weeks later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. Here's Felix coming, and what would most people, again, Felix is another opportunity for Paul to state his case, but what would most people in Paul's situation want to talk to Felix about?
His freedom.
Right. Well, they've got me here wrong, but notice what does Paul want to talk to him about? Yeah, he's wanting a witness to him. He wants to share the truth with him. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." What do you think Felix was afraid of?
He was being convicted.
Right. The judgment to come, if you notice. What does that mean? What do you think Paul was talking about, the judgment to come? What judgments awaits those who are outside of Christ? Hell. I think he was preaching hellfire and brimstone to him, and it scared him because he was talking about righteousness, denying yourself, picking up your cross. You can put all those words there, self-control, denying self, and the judgment to come. And Felix was afraid. He says, so I'll send for you. So he was under conviction because I think he was afraid of hell. I think that's what Paul was talking to him about. Yep. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. Why was Felix hoping Paul would offer him a bribe?
He was a politician.
He was a politician. He's going money. He's absolutely right. He's a politician. Yeah. And how does that tell you also about how Felix felt about Paul's guilt? Paul's innocent of everything. Yeah, I think he knows it. So he's trying to at least find something on him too. Maybe I can get him for bribery is another thing he could be doing. But look how many years passed. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. So Paul is for 2 years under house arrest, basically. And so he is succeeded. So Felix basically is out of office now, and this Porcius Festus is coming in. But he wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, so he had left Paul in prison. So it kind of lets you keep where Paul is. And it says in prison, but why did he keep him? He was in his palace too. But why did Felix keep Paul in prison during those 2 years? And it says at the very bottom. He wanted to keep everybody. He's a politician. He wants to keep the Jews happy, so he keeps him basically on house arrest. He wants to keep the the Roman citizen's happy because he's a Roman citizen, so he can't be torturing him. So he's straddling the fence. He's doing what politicians do. So 3 days after arriving in Provence, so we got this new Porcius Festus coming in. So 3 days after he arrives, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. And remember, Caesarea is up in the corner, Jerusalem's here. They always say up because Jerusalem was up on a hill, although it's actually going south. We would typically say they go down to Jerusalem, but he's making that trip from Caesarea to Jerusalem, which is about 60 miles altogether. And there is what Caesarea looks like. And just to give you a little background, it was like a big area along the coast that had a lot of shipping and things going on. But anyway, 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. So obviously he's going there for a reason. He's got this guy in custody. He's been there for 2 years, and he's now in control, and he's probably wanting to figure out what am I going to do with this guy. They requested Festus, as a favor to them, to have Paul transferred back to Jerusalem. Do they think they really want to talk to Paul? No, look what they're after. For they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Paul has been out of Jerusalem for 2 years under house arrest, and they still want to kill him. And that plot should sound familiar, because that's exactly what they had done before. If you remember, this is before, when he was leaving Jerusalem, go up to Caesarea. Some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink till they'd kill Paul. There was over 40 of them at that point in time.
Sounds like the Democrats.
Yep.
Yeah, it does.
Still want to get rid of Trump.
Yep, so all the way back when he was getting ready to leave from Jerusalem, they wanted to kill him, and they told a lie. Now they're trying to get him to bring him back to Jerusalem so they can kill him. So Festus answered, Paul is being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. Why do you think Festus is asking for them to come to Caesarea?
It's neutral ground.
It's neutral ground, and ground also, keep in mind, we always know God is in control. God knew if he went back to Jerusalem, they were going to kill him, and it wasn't his time yet. So he's using Felix to actually create them to come back. And how can we apply that to our lives today? Well, whenever we're whatever we're going through, we know that God's in control and works out the best for each and every one of us. So after spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. So again, here we go again. Paul said now he's got a new person to stand in front of, but Paul's going back to the court again. It says in front of Festus, it says, when Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they could not prove them. Does that sound familiar? It's the same thing happening over again. Then Paul made his defense again. I have done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? So all of a sudden we see Festus he's wanting to get rid of the problem, and he knows he can get rid of the problem. And he can actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He can get this guy out of his palace, and he can make the Jews happy. But what's going to happen if Paul goes up there? And why is this a favor to the Jews? Well, because he knows that the Jews are actually going to kill him. So Paul knows this, and Paul answered, I am now standing before Caesar's court, where I ought to be tried. I have not done anything wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. So now he's appealing to Caesar, is what he's doing. And that's a wise move by Paul, because it's almost like he's now asking for the Supreme Court to step in. He says, if, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he has now just raised it up another notch. So now he's got this guy nervous because Paul is actually basically saying, okay, I'm demanding I now go before Caesar, or in the United States, it'd be closest to it be the Supreme Court.
Over his head.
Yeah, he's going over his head. So then Festus had conferred with his council. And again, so Festus now is, remember, he's fairly new too in this role. So he's new in this role. He's trying to get rid of Paul, and now Paul's really creating a problem for him. So he thinks, well, why don't I do the same thing that the other guy did? I'm going to pass it off to Caesar. So after meeting with his council, or his group of attorney, his leadership, he declared, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Remember, Festus was just newly appointed, and I think it's probably part of them showing up to kind of show their support for him. So now the king is arriving. And again, what did Festus just do? Whenever he says, we're going to hand it off now to Caesar. We're handing it off to the king. Right, I like this one from Buzz Lightyear. He says, keep saying it's not my problem anymore. And that's what he's saying. It's not my problem. Right, I'm done with it. It's going on up to Caesar. This king is Herod Agrippa II. He is the son of the King Herod who killed James and imprisoned Peter. So that's who this king is. So it's about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, his brother of John, put to death with the sword. This is all the way back in Acts 12. So this is his brother. So this is the brother now of this King Herod here who's in charge. So all the way back in 12, we see that King Herod persecuted the church. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. That's a great story to remember, because remember what happened to Peter? Angels got him out of jail, saved his life. Herod Agrippa II is also the grandson of Herod the Great, who had all the male children killed in an attempt to kill Jesus. So these Herods have been after the Jews for quite some time. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respect to Festus. Bernice, I want to talk a little bit about Bernice, just so you're aware who that is. Bernice is actually the sister to Herod Agrippa II. They also had another sister, we'll discuss later. It's called Drusilla, who was married to Felix. So it wasn't uncommon back then. They had a lot of this incestuous relationship. So there's this relationship between Agrippa and his sister Bernice. That was a talk of the Rome where they grew up. So that's who was there. So since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. So there we go. So Festus is now in charge and says, well, by the way, king, I've got this interesting case. He says, there's a man who Felix, in other words, he's saying it's not my problem. Felix, who was there before me, there's this man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. And again, who's Festus blaming his problem on? Felix. Yeah, Felix didn't know what to do with him, so he left him for me. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned. I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they'd face their accusers and had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. Again, he's making it sound like he's following the rules. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man be brought in. Why is this case so challenging for the Roman courts?
They hadn't found anything to prove.
Right, because it has nothing to do with Roman law.
Yeah.
They're trying Jewish law in a Roman court. So that's where the difficulty is. So when his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I'd expected. So again, he was thinking that he must have done something bad. Well, they didn't. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. So that kind of summarizes what he got out of all of it. He says, I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial on these charges. But when Paul was made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. The Caesar ruling at this time was Nero. Perhaps the most infamous of Roman emperors, Nero Claudius Caesar. Caesar was just a title, but Nero Claudius Caesar ruled Rome from 54 AD until his death by suicide 14 years later. He is best known for his debaucheries, political murders, and persecution of Christians. So that's where Paul's headed to. So it says, Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear this man myself. He replied, Tomorrow you will hear him. So he's getting ready to meet with Festus and Bernice and all of them now. So I'm going to stop there because we're about out of time, and we'll pick up in Acts 25:22 on Wednesday. So, Joe, do you want to close us in prayer?